All right, can we just kick off? I see we have the hardcore here from the previous meetings, which is great. So there's going to be a really lively discussion. But unfortunately, I'm going to have to miss it because today my son is 18 years old. It was nothing. But I've had some ferocious emails from my wife about we are going out for supper at 7 o'clock. Don't be late. So I feel I cannot incur the wrath. The management has spoken. I have to leave. So I'm very pleased that I've managed to persuade Hakan to come and chair the meeting. Social Policy, who was doing some work with us in South Sudan in the Justice and Security Research Programme. And for those of you who are kind of new to these events have been organised by the Programme for African Leadership, which is a new initiative in the Department of International Development, where we are bringing African scholars to the LSE to study at postgraduate level. The first cohort have come through this year. We're now advertising for another 30 scholarships for next year, and we hope eventually to move up to something like 50 scholarships a year. Students coming from Africa, hopefully the idea is to bring people from war-affected parts of Africa, mostly, who would not otherwise have the opportunity to come and study at somewhere like the LSE. And it has been the most extraordinary thing this year to have such wonderful students together with our core cohort. It's really upped the ante in the department. I think all the other students have found it massively enriching to have all of you, in their classes. One of the initiatives that the Programme for African Leadership has initiated are these sessions on South Sudan, looking at what went wrong and what can be put right. And this is the third of them. And the idea of this one is particularly to emphasise what the region can do, what other African states might do, what the African Union might do. In the previous one, the last event, we looked particularly at the internal dynamics, but I'm sure the discussion will drift into all sorts of other issues. Now, so I'll hand over to you now, and you can introduce everybody. We have a list here, which you can read out.
Sure.
And I'm going to just hang around at the edges and then disappear and puff and smoke.
Well, as you were told now, my name is Hakan Seçkin-Elgin and I work in the Social Policy Department in the school. This light is really irritating.
Yeah, that's what I was saying.
So I'm going to turn it off actually until people use the slides.
Have you got anybody using PowerPoint?
Yeah, I think some.
No.
No?
Yeah, one
Yeah.
B.
Okay.
Well, read it, and then everybody read it and see what's there. And then
Okay. Excellent. We have four presenters and speakers, and the order of the presentations will be: first we have Hussein Marniot from South Sudan. He's a spokesperson for Riek Machar's delegation at Addis Ababa peace talks. And before that, he was the deputy governor for Jonglei State from 2005 until the recent violence of December 2013. Thank you for coming. The second speaker is Richard Todwong on my left. He's the minister without portfolio in the government of Uganda, and a member of parliament representing Nuoya County in northern Uganda. He has also previously worked as a special presidential advisor for northern Uganda. Then the third speaker will be Dr. Edward Thomas, who is on my right here, who worked in Sudan and Egypt for 12 years as a teacher, human rights worker, and researcher. His PhD focused on the history of Republican movement, a Sufi-inspired group that called for the reform of Islamic law and civil rights for all Sudanese. He is the author of Islam's Perfect Stranger, The Life of Mahmoud Mohammed Taha. I don't know. Goodness. So there you are. And on my extreme left is our fourth speaker, Naomi Pendle, who's a PhD candidate at LSE. Her research focuses on local justice amongst Nuer and Dinka-speaking communities to the west of the Nile in South Sudan. She has worked in research in South Sudan for 5 years. and currently working for AIRCOM, assisting the Office of Transition and Conflict Mitigation in USID. Well, welcome to this evening's events, and we'll start with Hussein.
Well, thank you.
Would you like to come here, because you can be recorded better?
I'm just
here.
running away from the light, actually.
Yeah, I'll just turn it off. So it's turned off.
I was the first to run away.
So we are trying to bring them back. Here we are.
Do we need the mic here, or it's okay?
Just the directional, so you need to put it just here.
All right?
Yeah, that's
Yeah, you need this.
It's okay. If I can grab my water there, that's the one open door. Well, thank you. I would like, first of all, to thank the panel for inviting me here and the listeners. I want to correct two things from my introduction. First of all, before we start, I was a deputy governor from 2007.
Okay.
Yeah, please. Number two, I don't want to be introduced as a spokesperson for Riek Machar because we are not there for individuals.
Okay.
Riek Machar can go today, and I'll be still a spokesperson for the SPLM, SPLA. You better rather put it as in opposition, although we don't accept this, but it's better than actually being a spokesperson for one person. First of all, I want to appreciate this meeting because I was told there were so many sessions here on South Sudan. You want to know what went wrong and how can we fix it. This is very important because I can see it, you are trying to help my country. And this is good when there are scholars here and people who are actually advising as policymakers. I believe we can find a good way forward. I don't know how far you have gone because I remember here in the same panel here, one of my colleagues was here, someone whom I respect, Dr. Benjamin. He spoke on behalf of the government. And today, I believe he has given you the narrative on the side of the government. How did this crisis started? Before we come actually to the African regional dynamics, I will divide my time. I will talk very briefly on how these things started, and then we see the regional dynamics. Up to December, I don't want to take you long for a long history about South Sudan. Immediately after the independence in 2011, South Sudan, after the independence, we believe that South Sudan was trying to live like any other independent nation under the leadership of Salva Kiir, whom all of us we voted for as our president. Definitely, as a young country, there were crises within the ruling party, which is actually the SPLM. And some of these problems, maybe they have started even before independence, but people were sort of like leaving this as we have a big issue before us, which is actually the referendum, that we could actually address some of these problems later on. Because what was happening in South Sudan, there were so many things that were going wrong. I believe some of the people here, they followed what was happening. Some of these were actually the issues to do with the party. The largest party in the country that actually brought the independence of the country is the SPLM, Sudan People Liberation Movement, plus other South Sudanese political parties that also contributed. Within the party, things were not running well, and the chairman of the party, or the chairperson, Salva Kiir Mayardit, was the person to be blamed because he did not allow the party to have a debate for some reforms. and things went on. So many things were happening in the country. Of course, as the leading political party in the country, maybe 90% of the government is the SPLM government. For sure, if there are crises within the party, they will spill over to the government. This is how things happened. So with us, so many things went wrong. And one of the things that I want to say, first of all, and this will lead us and will guide us in this discussion, is that what is happening in South Sudan today is not tribal. This is one thing that all of us, the people of South Sudan, believe that is not tribal. But the unfortunate thing is that one person wants to exploit this to use it as tribal conflict. And that is our president. And I will tell you why we see this as he's using it as a tribal conflict today. As I said, the problem started as a party and later engulfed the whole country. And now you cannot call it an SPLM issue anymore. It is actually a national issue, a national crisis that we need to fix, all of us. It's not any SPLM again. Because people who have died, they know nothing about the SPLM. Small children, women, elderly people who have died, they have nothing to do with the SPLM. So it has gone beyond the SPLM as a political party. So the crisis within the party was that the party was not functioning well. The structures were not respected. There's a mix-up between the government and the party. The president was ruling the party by issuing decrees, relieving and appointing within the party. And one of them is the Secretary General of the party that was actually suspended and was being tried. We saw that it was not completely, is opposite to even the rules of the party. But we saw this, the president was using his powers in the government as well as in the party, which are not there. Again, the president intentionally was keeping down the process of convention of the party because there were crises for leadership contest, that if the party is called today for a convention, he was not sure if he has not done his own homework that he might be re-elected again. So the convention was kept down not to take place, and that was the work of the president. There were so many violations of the constitution of the party by the same person who is actually the chairman of the party. There was also again in the government violation of the constitution of the country. So the president will jump from the party to the government, from the government to the party, and everything was happening with the authority of one person. And the president, some of you remember, when the crisis started, he started dismissing his running mate, who was actually the former vice president, Dr. Machar. And then he started dismissing elected governors, which we see as a violation of the constitution. These are people who are elected like him. Because when we went for the elections, people were voting in for the president, the governors, and the MPs. And he can dismiss them. He has that authority, that violating the constitution. So the president, rather, instead of elected president, whom we see that can be a democratic person, turned to be a dictator. And it is very unfortunate that our country, as very young, it started with dictatorial governments. There were a lot of human rights violations. And it happened that a journalist was killed. All of us we know, Isaiah Abraham was killed in the hand of the security of the government. Everybody does this. He was shot in his house. And no trace up to today. I remember some people were saying there was investigation going on. Never. It never happened. So all the media houses, all the columnists who write, they are intimidated, they are harassed, they are threatened for their lives, and they cannot do anything. So all this, the senior members of the SPLM saw it that there are crises in the party. So the best thing is that we advise the president and we call for a meeting so that we can actually do some reforms. So the whole lot was actually a call for reforms in the government, in the party. So a group of senior persons went for a press conference on the 6th of December, and the president felt intimidated. And these are the most senior people in the party. And because of this, the president was upset, and immediately he called for the National Liberation Council meeting, which later went on. And the president, in his opening remarks, was almost declaring a war. Because the people of South Sudan have reconciled. In 1991, there was a split, and the people left that history behind. And we opened a new page, we forged a new life, and we got our independence. But the president was singing very loudly in Dinka. We have the clips that all what happened in 91 will never repeat itself. So we see our president becoming more tribalist than others, which is very unfortunate. This is something that we were not expecting in him. And now, the group that went for a press conference, they had to move out of the meeting because they didn't want a showdown. What happened afterwards is that the president immediately ordered for the arrest of these people. And to start this, is how to disarm the presidential guards who are actually Nuer. Because the presidential majority of it is actually either Dinka and the Nuer. These are the largest ethnic groups. And this is what happened. So with this, there was a fighting. And unfortunately, to tell you this, in this house, over 20,000 people were killed. Who doesn't know this? All the diplomats, the NGOs who are working there, they know it, that a lot of people were killed by a private army, a militia group that was actually brought by the president, living in Juba, being paid from the government, which are not in the registry of the army. This is a private army. We know it all. Sincere members of Dinka community will tell you this army, we don't like it. So with this came immediately after the killings, a lot of people got angry. There's uprising in Malakal, in Jongule, in Unity State, and for sure, of course, a lot of people died in the process. So with us, President Salva Kiir was very quick to invite in Museveni, which we are seeing South Sudan now as another province of Uganda. I'm sorry to say this was my comrade here. Because South Sudan, honestly, today, is like Gulu, is like any other part, I don't know the provinces, maybe the minister can tell me. It's being run from Uganda. Our central bank has moved to Uganda. Okay? $300 million US. Who doesn't know? It's a story. So, and the unfortunate thing with the UPDF, the Uganda People Defense Force, they came in, bombing indiscriminately, using cluster bombs. Who doesn't know this? The UN demining teams, they got it between Pariag and Bor. They reported this, and we are grateful to Ban Ki-moon. The Secretary General condemned this because he has a report from United Nations. It's not from South Sudanese. Museveni is saying no. Salva Kiir is saying no. He did not use this and all this. Can the UN lie? We never commissioned UN to go and do this. So I want to say, that's what happened in South Sudan. Quickly, if I still have a few minutes. Okay. The regional dimensions and dynamics. Honestly speaking, of course, South Sudan is neighboring to all these countries, and we share borders, we share communities. In Uganda, we have South Sudanese who there are other cousins on the other side. The same thing in Ethiopia, in Kenya, and all this. Definitely, if there's war in South Sudan, it will affect the region. So the Africans, whether this is IGAD, whether this East Africa community, they have a role to play to see that there is peace. But the unfortunate thing, we are seeing that Uganda can actually benefit more today if there is peace in Uganda and in South Sudan rather actually instability. So IGAD, with their mandate, we appreciate the role that they are playing. But the unfortunate thing, I tell you, that we are confused. It's like you having two hands here. One hand is stealing and one hand want to be an angel. It cannot work because these are your two hands of one body. IGAD is telling us we are mediating peace, and the other hand of IGAD is bombing South Sudan using cluster bombs, weapons that are prohibited. It's very unfortunate. So it gives us a lack of faith in IGAD itself. African Union is a big club. There's nothing that I can see they can offer, to be honest. Because, you know what, as a young country, we need to learn. All of us, those who have families, apart from the young people who are here, when you have children, the first child is a ruly child, the second and the third. The last one, the young one, will learn the tricks of the old ones. South Sudan is in the middle of countries that do not have value human lives. And this is unfortunate. Our leader now is learning very fast and become more skillful than in the region with killing people, lynching people. It never happened in the culture of South Sudan, where the Dinka, Nuer, and all, they don't lynch people. If you want to fight, we put a fight. I say we fight. That's full stop, face-to-face fight. But this issue of lynching and all these are cultures are coming into South Sudan, and our government, through the brutal security organs, are now learning the tricks more faster. And a child who wants to learn tricks of being a thief can actually beat the master. And this is very unfortunate. I know you said a few minutes. And unless if I come in later when...
if you want to read questions.
Well, I want to say something that you mentioned. One of the issues also, in the region, the issue of the media and the issue of humanitarian. I know. With the humanitarian, there are two problems. That you want an African-led humanitarian sort of like relief. It is good, it sounds good, but most of these countries are living either under corruption or poverty. And the culture of giving, generosity, is learned from the house. We share things. The culture of volunteerism, that you can volunteer and go and do things, like these young people who are here. You get in other, Western countries, you get some people leaving the universities and go and volunteer and work for 6 months, giving part of their time to people who need it. But that culture has not come to us. It's something that we need to work hard about it. But some countries, yes, a lot of refugees now who have run to these countries is a big burden to these countries. So they need to come in actually to work for peace in South Sudan so that we can share whatever is there. It is very unfortunate that people are wishing South Sudan to collapse in the region, maybe for some other interests. Very unfortunate. Personally, I could see that still there is a chance that the people of South Sudan can work together and quickly trying to address the root causes to the conflict and trying to put possible solution to this so that we can, all of us, go to our country. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thank you. Swiftly move to our next speaker, Richard Togbong.
Thank you, and definitely I'll have to thank you for inviting me to be part of the panel. I'm not here to defend or to speak on behalf of the government of South Sudan or about what is happening in South Sudan in the context of any person coming from South Sudan. I'm here mainly to speak about the involvement of Uganda and the proximity to the conflict in South Sudan to the relationship that we shared over the years with South Sudan. But before that, allow me touch on a few basics that can make us reflect our minds on how Africans have transited over the years. It will help us appreciate that the conflict in South Sudan is not unique to South Sudan. If you look at the history of all African countries, post-independence African countries have gone through what South Sudan is going through. So to me, I would say what South Sudan is going through, most of the African countries have gone through, and it's something that is expected. It's something that might not end soon. It is something that we should all pray for. Uganda has gone through. DRC Congo is still going through the same. Rwanda up to now is still going through. Burundi, Kenya to some extent. Tanzania because of other ideological issues. We talk of Sierra Leone, Liberia, the main Sudan. So this is not unique to South Sudan. When you look at the phases of the transition in Africa, we started from the pre-colonial times when our society were organized according to norms of values of cultures and chiefdoms and kingdoms. We transited to the period of exploration and a trade and introduction of religion. After that, we went to the areas of colonialism. All these were touching on the basic fundamental issues of African society. Then we came to the post-colonial period, where independence were given to African states who failed to manage their affairs because of the distortion that were caused. And up to now, we have another new terminology of globalization that came with a lot of things of structural adjustment, economic reforms, competitive leadership, Millennium Development Goals, and all that. These are distortions that could not find fundamental or foundations to which they could relax on. Now, the most touching area is that we are moving some of these countries too fast to the speed of the first world countries, that we are now demanding. Of course, peace and security is a must to any country for any thing to happen. But we are asking for transparency, accountability, citizens' participation on democratic issues. We're asking for freedom of the media. And then there are also roles of non-state actors who are coming to play interest in all this. Then the professions without boundaries are coming into these areas. Of course, private sectors are moving on. Now, nation states over the world have become a subset of the global interest. That whatever happens in South Sudan, whatever happens in Uganda is a concern for the whole world. And then that is the context through which Uganda gets involved in South Sudan. South Sudan is not a country for South Sudanese alone now. When Uganda got involved in South Sudan, more than 100,000 Ugandans were locked up in South Sudan. Many of them were in cells in South Sudan when this conflict broke out. Some of them were in houses without food for days. Many of them, their properties that were trading in South Sudan were looted, taken by force. Ugandans were being banned by warring factions in South Sudan. And so all these were things that, to some extent, made Uganda move closer to the crime scene. And of course, we didn't go without being invited. You can't go to somebody's home without being invited. Uganda was invited by the government of South Sudan to come and help normalize peace and to stabilize the situation, which was chaotic. Now, the involvement of Uganda were only in two areas. One, to maintain peace in the capital, Juba, and to secure the international airport, Juba International Airport, which enables so many other non-South Sudanese citizens to find space to move out of South Sudan. And by far, my brother here would also agree with me that the presence of UPDF in South Sudan helped the situation normalize to some extent. Now, Uganda is not part of the conflict. This is very true and very clear. We wish South Sudanese all the best they can have to normalize their relationship with themselves. You know, when countries of the formatory stages of countries, when there is greed and grievances in a country, external forces cannot resolve that. However much we try to rely on external assistance, whether IGAD, whether the East African Community, whether the African Union, whether the UN, whether London School of Economics audience, we shall never come to a solution until these gentlemen find within their hearts of hearts time and peace that they can sit and talk to each other genuinely. My friend here is trying to downplay the ethnic tone in which this conflict is taking. It's true. when leaders clash, when structures of governance, because you see, governance in Africa is being seen as the structure that distributes wealth and opportunities to citizens. So when there is competition in the structures and dominance in the structures that distribute this wealth and opportunities, people fight. And in South Sudan, these scholars will tell you, because they have done a lot of work in South Sudan, when militias are recruited on tribal lines, when South Sudan became a state, most of these commanders found it difficult to surrender their militia groups to the good of the government of South Sudan. Many of them still maintain control of their forces. And it became difficult to create a force. I compare this to what happened in Uganda in 1986. Before we reached 1986, Uganda got independence in 1962. From 1962 to 1986, Uganda was chaotic, just like what is happening in South Sudan. But when Uganda finally got some leverage of peace, Uganda started from foundation, square one, to build a national army which is recruited on values of the country, not tribal lines, to train them, to make them disciplined, to make them respect human life, human rights and values, and human properties. Now, all these are stages that Uganda has gone through, but I think we were over-stampeding South Sudan to move through these stages very fast, and definitely the center could not hold, and it happened as it did. Now, as my friend here said, Uganda, we share a lot with South Sudan. I am a Ugandan and actually from Uganda, but the majority of Achulis are in South Sudan. So when you cut the boundary, the border between the Achulis of Uganda and the Achulis of South Sudan, we speak the same language, we share the same culture. There is no difference between me in Igulu and the Achulis in South Sudan. The Madis in northern Uganda are in South Sudan. The Ringas in northern Uganda are in South Sudan. The Kakwahas in northern Uganda are in South Sudan. And so forth, so forth. So many of these tribes, we are interlinked. Now, even in trade, the informal trading we do with each other, the community are so peaceful with one another, but the challenges is the structures of government, the structures of leadership tries to cause problems. Even before this conflict started, Uganda has had problem with the border with the South Sudanese. This, I'm sure my friend here is aware, that the leadership in South Sudan at times would like to extend the border of South Sudan to take control of some parts of northern Uganda. But because being who we are, we at times try to ignore such, say we are brothers. The border is not something we should fight for. But this, from Koboko to Moyo to Lamuo in Kitgum, we have these issues of border tension between Uganda and South Sudan. But the leadership of Uganda has always kept quiet. When South Sudan was going to sign the CPA in 2005, before the signing of the CPA, my brother here knows that Uganda played a very critical role that brought South Sudan to sign with the Khartoum regime. And definitely Uganda became a very key player in this. Now, currently as I speak, Uganda as a country, being a landlocked country, compared with the rest of the neighboring countries that we share borders with, we get a lot and we benefit a lot, like my brother said, through the trade that we do with South Sudan. We earn more foreign exchange from South Sudan than with Rwanda, Congo, and even with Kenya. So it is in our interest as a country that South Sudan is peaceful so that we continue trading with them. They also know that when Uganda is at par with South Sudan, they equally benefit. Most of these gentlemen, they have properties in Uganda. Most of them, their children are studying in Uganda. When you go to Uganda, these ones who have done research, they will tell you that because in Uganda we are practicing, we were implementing the policy of universal primary education. In the morning, you'll see children from South Sudan coming to study in Uganda. In the evening, you see them walking, crossing the border, going home. The women are coming for antenatals in Uganda, and they go back to their homes. So Uganda and South Sudan, we are just brothers and sisters. Now, this brings me to the other areas of the issue of the ideological and the external players into this kind of context. Of course, we have the Arab chauvinistic interest in Africa, which is real, which is trying to play our people together. And by the way, if you care to study the DNA of the African people, Africa is mainly comprised of 4 basic types of people. The rest are as a result of migrations and intermarriages. We have the Afro-Asiatic people who are found in North Africa mainly, Morocco, Egypt, part of Libya, and all those, Tunisia, and all those countries. Then we have the Bantus, we have the Luos. When you look at me and my brother here, we are the Luo stock, but one could be a Luo, a plain land Nilot, and another a river land Nilot. I have 5 minutes. So all these are things that we put together. Then of course we have the Hottentots and all that. Now, he raised a lot of allegations about Uganda involvement in Africa. If you are neighboring a home, and for instance, the man is quarreling with a woman, and you are going to help, should you help the wife, you might be misunderstood. I hope we know this.
Yes.
We know this. So you help the owner of the home. South Sudan has an owner. And this is the government of South Sudan that invited the government of Uganda. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Interesting analytical intervention there from Richard. I think we just will come back to some of these discussions. Now we are turning to Thomas here, and I'll...
Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me here today. I'm very honoured to be joining this panel of distinguished speakers, and I want to speak briefly about regional dynamics, and I'd really like to theme this talk about around roads. I don't know if it's on. Yeah. Because I want to talk about the sort of infrastructural basis and the trade basis for international relations or regional relations. Because one of the many unexpected revelations coming out of the tragic turn to violence in South Sudan is the speed with which the government in Juba moved to consolidate its alliances with neighbouring countries. Before that, the government had even worked out whether or not it could trust the SPLA to maintain order, it had drawn on the support of the Ugandan army to secure its capital, the airport in its capital, and its borders. In January, it concluded a rapprochement with Khartoum, even briefly considering a reoccupation of South Sudan's oil fields by the security forces of its former adversary. Juba had blamed every other South Sudanese mutiny of the past 9 years on Sudan, regardless of the many local contradictions that each mutiny reflected. But when this big mutiny arrived, Khartoum's interest in the stability of South Sudan's government became very clear. Other neighbours are also investing in the current government. And in January, it felt in a weird way as if South Sudan's government was coming of age as a state. It was using the international system and the regional system to shore up its internal position. Since 2012, when South Sudan and Sudan had fought a brief war, South Sudan had begun borrowing money internationally too, and it run up about $4 or $5 billion of debt by November 2013. So the government was using international credit to maintain its internal order. I think that looking at South Sudan's role in the regional economy and taking up what Honourable Richard has talked about in terms of Uganda's trade interests in Sudan is a very interesting way of thinking through the international implications of what is happening at the moment, and it might help to shape ideas about what is coming next. So South Sudan's economy has a very unusual composition. Oil makes up over half of GDP and nearly all of exports and nearly all of government revenues. And it also makes South Sudan a country with one of the highest GDPs per capita in the region, far away, far above its neighbours. So it meets many of the definitions of a rentier state, a state that relies on its ownership rights over local resources for its income, rather than the productive forces in society. Another unusual thing about South Sudan is that a lot of the domestic product goes out of the country. You can tell that from the difference between national income and national product. So GDP, domestic product, is the value of all the goods and services produced in the country, but GNI, national income, is the income received in the country from those goods and services as salaries and profits. It's the money that stays in the country. And a lot of the wealth produced in South Sudan goes to foreign investors and on oil fees to Sudan. So it's a really striking difference between its neighbours, isn't it? How much money goes out of the country. And that's a really important thing for international relations, because other countries are also living off South Sudanese rents. South Sudan is not the only rentier state. This table is from 2011, before South Sudan cut Sudan's share of the rents. And that decision was a very fraught one. It led to a year of war and tension, more than a year of war and tension. So it shows you that managing that difference is a really important task for the South Sudanese government. And reductions to other countries' share of these rents presents many risks for a relatively weak newcomer state. And the oil itself doesn't stay in the region. The oil that makes up so much of South Sudan's exports, it mostly goes to East Asia or to Asian markets. But the imports from neighbours are very regionally significant. And Uganda is by far the most important exporter to South Sudan. In the 3 years from 2005, which is when the most recent publicly available statistics cover, in the 3 years from 2005, when the autonomous government of South Sudan was set up, exports increased tenfold, from about $60 million to $600 million a year. In the same period, Kenyan exports more than doubled to about $150 million worth. Sudan is still a very important exporter too, although exports have become very volatile because of political crises and because of this rent thing that I was talking about. And bringing things down from Sudan to Juba costs a lot more than bringing it from Mombasa to Juba. This was before the current crisis. So Ethiopia is politically very important in the region, and the big country, the big brother of the region. It has a big economy, and prices are much lower than they are in Uganda or Kenya for anybody that's lived in the area. But Ethiopian exports to South Sudan are very, very small. They're just a border trade in grain and livestock, according to the African Development Bank, from which all these figures are taken. So South Sudan and Uganda. There you go. That's just 3 or 4 years of that's Uganda. How Uganda's exports to other countries, and that's South Sudan's. The red line is South Sudan. So you can see how important South Sudan is to Uganda's economy. That sometimes flattens out. That rise sometimes flattens out because of insecurity and because of problems faced by Ugandan traders in South Sudan, because they often face crises and times of violence, and because a lot of this trade is informal. If traders get attacked or targeted, they stop trading. A lot of South Sudan's imports come through Mombasa, but they go through Uganda to get to Juba. There's a small border crossing on the Kenyan border near Kapweta, but only a tiny amount of trade goes through there because the road is not tarred and because there's been some insecurity in the Kapweta area. Now, it's hard to find good maps of the roads of South Sudan, but it's not. It has one of the poorest road infrastructures in Africa, and there's only one tarred road, and that's it there. It goes from Juba to the Ugandan border at Nimule. That's the road going to Kenya, and it's not tarred. It goes through some quite violent areas. Most imports travel in by road, and the exports go out by the pipeline through North Sudan. So the lorries that go into Sudan from Uganda, they come back empty a lot of the time. Infrastructure. The government in Juba has always realized that infrastructure is a very important way of dealing with the problems that I've briefly set out here. And its spending figures are very high, second only to defense. But in the past 9 years since the SPLM took over government, there's only one road that has been built, the Juba-Nimule road. And it was a very significant road for South Sudan as well as for Uganda. Inflation in Juba fell from 40% to 10%, according to one economist, when the road was completed. So it means a lot for both countries. And before the current crisis, there'd been a lot of discussion about road building in South Sudan. Tarred roads cost a lot more to build in South Sudan than elsewhere in Africa, about $1 million per kilometre. The Ugandan road cost even more than that. There are plans for roads to Ethiopia and Kenya, and these might bring down the enormous cost of moving goods to Juba. It's one of the most expensive places to ship to. And it costs more to move a ton of goods from Kampala to Juba than almost any other road in the continent. But the current priority roads are really to connect. This is the government gave out its priority roads at an investment conference, and they're really roads that connect with Sudan and with Kenya. Those are the current priority roads, and there's been no movement on getting them started, these priority roads. And the current crisis will make it hard for the government to find the financing needed to make progress. So I'd like to just conclude with 2 or 3 remarks, if that's okay. First of all, this crisis will change South Sudan, or is likely to change South Sudan's relationship with Sudan. If the current rapprochement holds, South Sudan is likely to be more committed to government stability in Khartoum, and that has many implications for Sudan's many civil wars. Second, I think the crisis is likely to deepen South Sudan's dependence on Uganda. Alternatives to the Uganda road are likely to be postponed, and with it, South Sudan's integration into the wider regional economy. South Sudan was last year on the point of beginning accession negotiations with the East African Community, a regional trading bloc bringing together Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, Rwanda and Burundi. But after the crisis hit, the East African Community's Secretary General reportedly said that the crisis did not augur well for its bid for membership in the community. And finally, the infrastructure that undergirds South Sudan's international relationships has got many implications for South Sudan's own development. It's making Juba the economic centre of the country. It's just one pipeline going to one destination in the country, and it's pushing it towards a unipolar development model. And that's the same model that caused a century of crisis in Sudan, and it's also the same model that might lead to the breakup of the United Kingdom. You know, all the money in this country comes to London. You know? And now, if you want to organise against that, you have to organise regionally in this country, and that also could happen in South Sudan.
Thank you. Yes, now our last speaker. Now, please. Do you have a slide?
It's all right. I don't need the slides. It's fine. So first of all, thank you for having me. It's always very humbling coming after such comprehensive discussion that's already happened. So I just hope I can draw together a few of those thoughts. What I want to talk about to start with is how South Sudan has already become a theatre for competing powers and competing institutions within the region, but kind of more broadly than that. And then I want to end with a couple of thoughts about how that competition and outside involvement is affecting the internal dynamics and politics in South Sudan itself. So firstly, looking at South Sudan as already a theatre for these kind of competing powers and institutions, I just want to give a quick survey, but not a comprehensive survey. There are many people already involved in South Sudan, countries and international institutions, but I'll mention a few, and some have already been mentioned. So one that hasn't been highlighted yet is the Kenya-Ethiopia dynamic, the two significant regional powers in IGAD, but in the East African community as well. Ethiopia having recently overtaken Kenya as the largest economic power in the region. And it's interesting to compare Kenya's previous role in the kind of the pre-CPA, pre-2005 negotiations compared to now. So in the past, we've seen the Sudan peace negotiations hosted by Kenya, and now we're seeing the peace negotiations hosted by Ethiopia. We've also seen a shift from the humanitarian efforts really previously, pre-2005, being based from Kenya. OLS was really run from Kenya. It now seems increasingly that a lot of that will be shifted to Ethiopia. So there's some element of competition there. It's interesting to think about that dynamic, obviously not a kind of military dynamic, but a very kind of political and economic dynamic, and the benefits of hosting those things in your country. And interestingly, as I'm sure you're all aware, when there were 7 detainees that were released to Kenya by the South Sudanese government, and they were released to the care of Kenya, and then later on they went to Ethiopia to participate in the negotiations. And there was a small example there of a possible element of competition when the release of the detainees to Ethiopia was delayed, and there was possibilities that was based on the detainees requesting the negotiations to move back to Nairobi and back to Kenya and be hosted there. So possibly some kind of regional dynamics influencing the parties and asking them to change locations. The second, as we've already talked about, regional player that seems to be displaying its power and military power is obviously the Ugandan army, the UPDF in South Sudan. As speakers have already mentioned, the UPDF was there from the very earliest days. It seems that really within the first week negotiations had happened, and the UPDF has a presence in South Sudan, initially to protect its own civilians, but obviously their involvement has become much wider than that. And as Richard mentioned, Uganda has long been a friend of the SPLA, and the UPDF's involvement in South Sudan is nothing new. Even if you go back to the 1990s, you see the Ugandan army showing that it can be a power broker through its army in these regional dynamics. For example, the battle for Yei, many people, in 1997 there was a battle between the northern government of Sudan and the SPLA for control of Yei, and many people attribute the UPDF's involvement to the SPLA's victory then. So as Richard mentioned, a very kind of long-term alliance. But this is obviously now seeing a new dynamic for the UPDF in South Sudan that fits in with kind of since that 90s involvement, a kind of larger regional involvement of the UPDF, including obviously the LRA, as the LRA moved from Uganda to other areas in the region, but also their involvement in Somalia, and very much being part of the response to the war on terror and that dynamic, and being used as a force in the region in relation to that discourse and that situation. Again, the UPDF has been very involved in securing some of the key infrastructure in Juba. The road, the airport itself was very visible UPDF involvement, and then also the road down to Nimale. So although international organisations have not necessarily been very happy and have criticised, even the Security Council, some involvement of the Ugandan army, the visible benefits of the Ugandan army have also seemed to prevent a real kind of expulsion of the Ugandan army from South Sudan. So the international community, whether it's for the humanitarian efforts or for trade, have really benefited from the airport staying secure and the road to Uganda staying usable. And therefore, whatever kind of ideological concerns they might have with it, it seems that they haven't necessarily removed the Ugandan army. But the Ugandan involvement obviously brings up questions in relation to Sudan. Uganda and Sudan have often had an antagonistic relationship, and we now see a very unique situation where Sudan and Uganda are both publicly backing the government of South Sudan. So it seems to be some kind of strange, unusual new era of friendship between South Sudan, Sudan and Uganda, and the question is, I guess, what will happen to that in the future. Another country that's been mentioned in relation to this is Eritrea. It's been accused of supplying arms to the opposition. Eritrea has explicitly denied that, but everyone is very aware that Eritrea offers a corridor that possibly could be used for arms. Whether that's happened or not, or whether that will happen or not, again, is a question. Interestingly, these kind of unilateral by a nation-state involvement, whether Eritrea or Uganda, have been looked on very negatively. But then you have institutions which their kind of military involvement in the South Sudan theatre seems to have been less critically questioned, especially by the kind of international media. So, for example, of course, the UN is a military presence in South Sudan, adding to that dynamic at the moment. They seem very concerned with protection of civilians, and definitely not engaging in the way the UPDF is. But they are there, and they are a military presence. And of course, recently there was the fiasco where their arms were stopped in Lake State as they tried to move them up to Bentio, adding to the kind of politics of the UN involvement. And there's questions about whether there will be an IGAD or even an AU force has been mentioned in the discussions and in the media. And therefore you see the potential competition between these international groups. Whether IGAD or the AU or the UN will really be the kind of saving force for South Sudan and will enhance their legitimacy through that involvement. So interestingly, you see the IGAD talking with Egypt about troop involvement. So Egyptian troops coming as part of the IGAD force, although they've recently been suspended from membership from the AU. Also, the AU and the ICC seem to have entered a slight competition about who will be involved in justice or reconciliation, or kind of the peace brokering that comes out of this. With obviously IGAD leading the negotiations, but discussion of the AU maybe, or at least members of South Africa hosting an SPLM type internal peace meeting. So again, these international institutions really competing in the theatre that is South Sudan. And again, just to mention that this, of course, is not limited to the African continent, as the UN suggests, but also the ICC suggests. But the US seems to maintain a very special interest in South Sudan. For whatever reason, there's a lot of press coverage in the US, but also a lot of congressional and government concern about what's happening in South Sudan. And China has also said that this is a new chapter for China in terms of wanting to be involved in securing peace and stability in South Sudan. That was kind of mentioned by a special representative for Africa, the Chinese special representative for Africa in February, when he was attending a conference in Addis. So what exactly that means for China is still unclear, but there has been slightly more Chinese involvement than we might expect in the politics of this current dynamic. So I'm running out of time, but just to briefly mention one obvious implication for me of this regional dynamic on the internal dynamics of South Sudan. And that would be in relation to the UPDF and really the newer discourse. I mean, as has been mentioned already, many people have talked about this dynamic in terms of an ethnic conflict. This is a Dinka versus Nuer conflict, and that was very apparent in the early days in the media, especially the international media, not necessarily the African media. And of course, that's not the case. It's definitely not as simple as that. And if you look at the history of the Nuer, for example, it's very rare that they've had any kind of political unity or political ability to gather together. In fact, the last couple of decades have really been testimony to a kind of pervading Nuer civil war where they have fought with each other again and again. Whether, for example, in Unity State since 2011, with Gadet's rebellion as the SSLA fighting other Nuer government within the state, or going back to the 90s and Mashar's attempt to unify the Nuer that then seemed to fail, possibly resulting in him returning to the SPLA. But what's incredible has been the unity of the Nuer in the post-December 2013 violence. And as has already been mentioned, I think a lot of that is being attributed to what was perceived as targeted Nuer violence in Juba, with many Nuer reporting this 20,000 Nuer killed by the government in Juba. And whatever happened there, that narrative has been believed based on a history of perceived Nuer persecution in the 90s, but also the violence of disarmament campaigns in Nuer areas since the CPA. So the Nuer have really believed, and that has allowed a new unity of the Nuer, that the government is kind of out to persecute them and to really undermine their existence. So into that dynamic has really come the UPDF with the aerial bombardments against the Nuer, and what that's allowed to happen has encouraged this, this sense of Nuer being persecuted. I mean, the Nuer have had a long history of aerial bombardment by outside governments dating back to the 1920s. But aerial bombardment, more than anything else, has the perception of a distant government, and especially as bombardment often targets civilians or accidentally hits civilians, has another narrative that it's not just about a political military dynamic, but is about the wider population. And therefore that's fed further into this kind of Nuer homogeneity and this desire that the fight will keep going, and that suffering is only part of that at the moment. So I'll leave it there. I'm sure there's many questions.
Thanks very much. Would you like to just turn to the light anyway? So, thanks very much for this very interesting series of presentations. Now we have about 22 minutes for questions and discussions, and I want to take maybe 3 minutes out of that to allow speakers right at the end to respond to each other and talk to what the others were talking about. That leaves us about 18 minutes for you to ask questions and comments. Given the time is limited, I would appreciate if you succinctly put your point, question or comment, so that we can get as many people as possible into the discussion. And I'll get 3 comments or questions in the first round, and then I'll ask. You can ask your questions or comments to particular presenters or generally to the panel. Right, okay, the first here, gentleman in the middle and the lady right at the back, and then I'll get the others in the second round.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I think I will not bore you with my background, where I come from, what I've been doing. I will go straight to the panelists. And my question is that you need to agree with me that it has not been a coup. And you must agree with me that the president has been fighting an ethnic war because he has been preparing it for 2005, over-training his section and his tribe to fight the war of December 15. Thirdly, the IGAD. I believe all the IGAD partners are not very clean to be left by the Western world to try to solve the problem of South Sudan, because all of them are dictators, and actually they are teaching Salva Kiir Mayardit to toe the line, and his personal advisor had been President Museveni, who has been in and out to Juba to make sure that Salva Kiir follow what he has been doing in Uganda. And now, the replacement of UPDF, Uganda forces, is the so-called AU forces to replace them and be paid by South Sudan. And to me, it's just what is called mercenaries, because we will not accept this. And if the AU is left to be doing this, we love peace, but the war will continue. But already Uganda has failed to fight this war. It has been defeated very badly, and it will be defeated much more, because the more we go on, the more the Nuer are going to be stronger. One last word I'm saying, one last word I'm trying to tell you is that the Dinka people must come out very quickly, because we believe that we should not fight this war as Dinka Nuer. We don't do what Salva Kiir Mayardit has done. Nuer has never been raised any war against Dinka, because the nearest blood brother are the Dinkas themselves. So I disagree with the gentleman here. The London School of Economics might have known now who speak here as a pay in the payroll of a government or unpaid. I think you have distinguished this. I don't know where are you going to put me, because up to December 15, I never received my salary. I don't know whether you are going to put me in either ways. So if we allow this, then we are destroying the democracy that goes to Africa. Because democracy does not need us to be saying that we're a new country, that we cannot be democratic. Democratic world is the democratic world of today, from the Western world to Africa and to everywhere. It is the same. It is the people's rules. It should not be dictatorship rule like Salva Kiir and Museveni. Thank you.
That's a very good point to move to the next gentleman.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I'd like to extend all my thanks to the members of the panel. My name is Elhan Paul, and I'm South Sudanese. My question, brother, it's in twofold, in the sense that it's a comment, because I think it's a very important comment, and also a question.
Hopefully,
but I'll try to bring it, to within an acceptable time.
Maybe you should put the
Nobody my voice is loud. So but anyway, I've got a loud voice. My question goes to Honorable Richard Todlong. He stated that Uganda is not part of the conflict in South Sudan. And I think that's a very interesting assertion, in the sense that on the 27th of December, President Museveni, in company of Kiir, echoing the members of IGAD in Nairobi, said that we will defeat Riek Machar, and used the word we, including himself. He had already by that statement become part of the conflict. And he backed that up by bringing the UPDF to Sudan, and the UPDF bombing Sudanese citizens, spilling the blood of Sudanese citizens. And how on earth can someone come here and say Uganda is not part of the conflict? Of course Uganda is part of the conflict. It's killing South Sudanese in South Sudan. And moreover, to make things worse, he is the one running everything, as has been said. That's one part of the question. But the second thing is, to say that the conflict in South Sudan is not unique in Africa, I think is so misleading to the young people who are here and all the students. Because you have to remember that from the times of independence, when Africans were fighting colonialists, Britain and what have you, in the 60s, when most of them got independence, there was a completely different atmosphere. There was a bipolar world. There was America on one hand, and you've got the USSR on the other hand. And most of these wars fought in those African countries were influenced by those two countries, mainly. And so that made it completely different. Now, what's happening in South Sudan now is that the conflict that's happening in South Sudan happening completely a unipolar world, whereby there is no influence from outside. It's an internally a party issue, which is completely different from all the other conflicts that has been happening in other parts of Africa. And what happened is this. In Uganda, when the war that you refer to, Uganda was invaded by Tanzania. Sorry, Uganda invaded Tanzania, and then Tanzania responded and took Amin out. Uganda invaded Congo and took Mobutu out. It's not comparable to killing his own citizens, because there was a targeted killing in Juba. This is from the government. It's the same party, the ruling party, killing its own party members and killing a targeted ethnic group. That is genocide. Uganda would have done better to intervene on the side of React to stop genocide, but not to side with Kir. In a sense, Uganda actually can be implicated in the crime that is taking place in South Sudan.
Thanks very
because
much.
It's part
Thank
of
you.
that's what, you know, I would have said
Next.
one more.
Right up to back.
My name is Sarah, I'm from Kenya. 2 points. First was regarding the example that was given about acquiring neighbor and whether to intervene. I thought it would be interesting to look at it from a perspective of if you keep on intervening in your neighbor's affairs, then your neighbor and his wife will never get a chance to make the relationship work. If there's always the neighbor is always coming in to assist. And the second point is related to what the gentleman has said. I think to say that violence is not unique in Africa is sort of, you're basically saying that it's okay to use human life because it's part of a process, and I find that very problematic because one life cannot be equated to anything. If a person dies in rural, whichever part of South Sudan, that person is someone's brother, someone's mother, someone's sister, and as a government, I think there's a higher there's a higher need to identify the sacredness of life. So it doesn't matter who dies, whether they're not collateral damage. The fact is that we can't use development or war as an excuse of experience. I think 50 years down and Africa from independence, we've learned a lot, and we can capitalize on learning by not allowing South Sudan to fall into what other Africans have learned. So I don't think experience should be used as an excuse for making loss of life normal.
Thanks very much. Now over to the panel. So who wants to have a go? I think Richard probably allowed to lead.
Thank you. Wow, Uganda. I think we need to know that UPDF is a very professional army. UPDF is not taking side because we know that the nature of conflict in the world is changing from interstate conflicts to intrastate conflicts. And you can't use bombs when conflicts are manifesting itself into tribal nature. And that is the thing that UPDF is. What UPDF is doing is to say, gentlemen, hold on, talk. Now, you're saying UPDF has been bombing in South Sudan, UPDF has been doing all these kind of things. Yes, if there are evidence, it will be brought on table, and definitely, when the president said that in the context of IGAD, he was not saying as president of Uganda and as Salva, joining hands with Salva to defeat Dr. Riek Machar. He was saying that in the context of IGAD, definitely IGAD is bigger than Dr. Riek Machar. And when IGAD resolves to say that we want peace in South Sudan, that resolution is bigger and is more pronounced than what Dr. Riek Machar would say. Two, we need to know that the world we live in, as we compare to the past, like you said, the USSR and the American time. By that time, definitely, as you said, the interests of the Americans, the USSR were not in Africa. But the interests of their allies were in Africa, the British, the French, the Belgians, and all that, with the colonies they had. And that was what I referred to in my introduction. And if you followed my introductory remarks properly, you would know that the dynamics that we have now and the dynamics that you have in South Sudan necessitates that you, South Sudanese, should sit, and I remember saying this, that you should sit and talk genuinely. We are not part of that talk. We don't know why you're quarreling with one another. Our concern is that your quarreling is spilling over, because I remember saying that South Sudan does not only belong now to South Sudanese. There are many other interests. He gave us graphs of how Uganda is benefiting from South Sudan. The world is becoming an economic world. So when you continue fighting, our economy suffers. Your people are dying, our people are dying. By the way, when South Sudan was gaining its independence, UPDF went there and our children died in South Sudan. We shed blood for the people of South Sudan. That is how close we are to the people of South Sudan. And so we don't want to wish, and we are not wishing, that the war in South Sudan should continue. We are there to say, why don't you come and talk meaningfully? Your issues of bad governance, lack of democracy, lack of human rights, abuse of office, those are not our issues. You need to sit and talk. But I'm surprised that some of you are still talking that you want to continue with the war. I'm surprised. Because war, well, you'll discuss about war later on, but you know the danger of war. But to us, we know the danger of war. And we are saying you better stop this war as soon as possible and go back to the talking table and talk meaningfully. Whether you should have a joint coalition government, whether you should cut short the time for elections and you go for elections, whether it depends on whatever you agree at the table, but it is you people to discuss and agree on the way forward. We are not part of the discussion and we are not part of whatever is going to take place in South Sudan. Our interest is external and we are only wishing you well and we continue to wish you well.
Thank you. Would you like to comment on any of the comments?
Well, first of all, I want to say, you know, the three people who made comments, actually I agree with them entirely. But I want to tell my comrade here, Comrade Richard from Uganda, you know, even your analogy when you conclude your presentation by saying, now you are saying Uganda is not part of this. I don't know, what do you mean by saying actually it's not part of what is happening in South Sudan, when already you said very clearly with the African analogy that if there's a quarrel between a husband and a wife, which is very unfortunate because even in South Sudan, I don't know who is a wife, who is a husband, you support the head or the husband for that matter. Already you have made it that actually you are supporting the government because Salva Kiir is the head, if that's my understanding.
Maybe I need to make can I make myself clear? Can I make myself clear on that? South Sudan has a leadership, and the leadership is headed by His Excellency President Salva Kiir, and that is what we recognize. Whatever changes that took place in South Sudan, we were not part of, and we shall continue to work with the government of South Sudan. Even if tomorrow you become the government, those in government, and you leave the bush and you become in government, Uganda will still be a very serious country that you need to deal with. So I'm speaking about the government of South Sudan, which has a president as of now. Is there another president other than Salva Kiir that I should know?
If I can conclude, yeah. Well, thank you. You know, it's not because I did not get the point you are trying to say. Okay. It's just because you are trying to say you are not part of what's happening. You are not part of what's happening. If I become the president tomorrow, I will never ask Uganda to bomb my own people with cluster bombs. That would be criminal, inhumane, and I will not see that my presidency and the thousands of people that will die, that will be equal to my leadership. I think, you know what, I come actually, you know, from South Sudan. I've been to Uganda several times. I know what's happening. There are a lot of things that my comrade here said. Let me tell you what happened. I don't want to give my testimony, but let me tell you what happened. Is that when the fighting started, I was there. We were sitting in a council of ministers like when we are sitting like this. We were shot at, and my bodyguards, they got killed. In a meeting, okay? It is the same government that you say, I need to be loyal to. Now, most of the African countries, including Uganda, except Kenya, that actually went out to bring out their nationals, none of them actually tried. When you are saying, you want to secure your people to get out and all these things. Your people were in the enemy's camp for protection with me together, all of us. And they were begging the Americans and the British who had actually their aircraft for them to be lifted out. When you are actually busy bombing, instead of actually bringing your trucks and all this. So my question is, when are you moving out of South Sudan? You know, when are you moving out of South Sudan? Because you said you are not part of this. When are you moving out? Thank you.
Thanks so much. We have pretty much probably space for 2 questions. I have this lady here, and then that gentleman right at the back. So this lady first.
Good evening. So from the talks, what I've gathered is there is a script somehow in South Sudan, but it's not legitimate. It's not considered legitimate. So what needs to be done to make sure, what are the next steps for South Sudan to make sure that the leadership is legitimate, whichever leadership it is? Because if these matters, people don't have trust, the social process is broken, and you can't move from this with that kind of fragmented leadership.
Thank you. Yes, please. Right at the
my name is Paul Montat. I'm from South Sudan. Actually, I'm sad, and as we are all sad for what happened in our home country. And the biggest sadness is based on the SPLM, which is the Liberated Party, as he said, as should be said, is the one which is causing the Spain trust, because we don't understand how could one party spread and cause this war. There's a problem. There's a question that somebody may need to ask. But the question which I want to ask, and I want to ask my brother Hussein, the governor of the state, and he comes to know the time and we talk about development issues. And he said that, these things are happening. So what I want to ask is, what are the chances of the SPLM reconciling and giving people South Sudan a chance to go back and build that country?
Thank you. Could I ask now your Eddie to...
They ask me, when are we moving out?
No, we'll just come to you. Time, deadlines. Yes.
Okay.
Work with deadlines. So, do you want to comment about the first question, maybe?
Oh, the legitimate. It was mentioned earlier actually, and the leadership to some is still very legitimate, and to others there is no possibility it can continue, and that's obviously a big problem. As someone mentioned earlier, this militia has come up often, or it's called a militia. It's part of the army, this armed group around Salva Kiir based out at Lorry Bridge. And in my mind, in a way, that hints at the long-term problems that were involved. There was this kind of reasonably recently constructed armed group that seems to be about presidential protection and that kind of a defence force. But that also seems to be indicative that this division has been much longer existing than maybe we're really talking about, that maybe that was a presidential response to something that he could see was coming, and maybe this crisis has proved him right, that the country was already very, very fractured, that the SPLA wasn't really anything like a national army, and nor was the SPLM really a national representing body, and that a lot of the division was already there. It had a very long history from the 80s, from the 70s, maybe from even before that. And that really to build a legitimate government is going to be a massive challenge. I don't have any answers, but I think the construction of that group was really possibly a response to just a recognition that might be needed, and not that he created it, the problem, but that was already massively pre-existing, whether it's the ethnic narrative or the division or the use of kind of the liberation discourse to justify power, that all those things had long been there, and a strong government had also long been there. So I think to make the government legitimate, I have no answers. Saying the problem is even bigger probably than we're talking about.
Thank you. Eddie?
Thanks a lot. I'm not sure I've got very much to say, and maybe I should address the same question, because I think these gentlemen have got a lot to respond to, and I don't want to take up too much time. But yes, legitimate leadership is needed, and there are questions about legitimacy every government faces these questions, and they're very stark when there's a conflict going on in your country. I think it's difficult to know, and certainly I'm not somebody who has the answer, but I'd just like to maybe put down a few considerations that need to be taken into account. First is that I don't think it's an ethnic conflict, but successive states in South Sudan since the 19th century have organized their relationship with rural South Sudan around ethnicity, and that's why ethnicity has got this heavy baggage. It's this burden of contradiction. It's a kind of political thing, but it should just be a human thing. Do you know what I mean? But it's turned into a political thing. So that's one thing that would be very difficult and a challenge to get round. The other thing is what I was saying about a rentier state. Well, South Sudan is a rentier state, and that is a state with a very strong concentration of wealth. So alongside this problem of organizing a relationship with the rural population around ethnicity, and now also with the urban population, you've got this thing that the state has many dilemmas about how to allocate wealth and how people are represented, because people are often represented through ethnic structures, because that's what the state has constantly been creating over a century, and you can't just magic that away very easily. And the other consideration I think to bear into account is there's a lot of pressure on, diplomatic pressure, to restore the status quo as it was before. And that's about a buy-off. That's about you get this and I get that, and I'll get this post and you get that post. And probably, and in some ways that would be welcome if it brought an end to the violence, because the violence is terrible. It's absolutely terrible. It's awful that people who've been through so much have got to go through this again. So I would certainly be very happy to see an end to the violence. But I think maybe that kind of end to the violence would be a shortcut end, and that more consideration about all these contradictions that South Sudan has, and they're very big contradictions, and it's not like that there's a lot of Mandelas who've worked out how to address them. You know what I mean?
Thank you. And then we really actually run out of time.
Oh no.
But of course, I will give two speakers a minute each to be very fast in responding. So maybe Richard can tell us the timeline.
One time,
for getting out.
One time in my class, the teacher asked whether we can describe a duck. So one student said, if it quacks like a duck, it walks like a duck, therefore it's a duck. So if we are saying we are running away from this conflict being an ethnic conflict, and yet it manifests itself into a ethnic nature, then therefore people are right to say it might be an ethnic conflict. But that is not to say the least. I was asked, when are we moving out of South Sudan? Definitely, as soon as possible, UPDF should move out of South Sudan. We don't want to keep our forces there for us. Now,
Inshallah.
IGAD passed a resolution that the protection deterrent force should be deployed in South Sudan to replace UPDF. And as soon as these forces have been deployed, UPDF is out. And UPDF is only within a very small area. It's not there for any other reason. And I hope they are calling UPDF out of South Sudan is not to say the conflict should amplify itself to do whatever they want. But to us, we say South Sudanese should strengthen the institutions of governance. They should encourage more of inter-community dialogue, so that the Dinkas and the Nuers leaders, because see, we have clan leaders, we have institutional leadership, these people should start talking more with each other than even the government, than these ones who are fighting. When we get leaders from these tribes, the clan leaders, the women to start talking, the youth from these people to start talking with each other, you'll start seeing peace coming among the community. We should encourage, we should demilitarize this ethnic recruitment. People should stop recruiting militias based on ethnic lines, so that they start building a national army based on professional etiquettes that a professional national army should have.
Thank you.
Of course, truth and reconciliation at one time will come up, that those who have caused problems will have to speak and should be forgiven. You know, when LRA was trying to find reasons to speak with the government, because the government was saying for a long time that LRA had no reason for fighting, they had to construct something in order for them to come on table to talk. So definitely we shall have to have reasons and you have to explain why you're fighting, and you have to come and. But we hope you stop that war and come back to table. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much. And the last one, please.
Well,
Yes.
thank you. Let me start with the last question, then I'll come to the just very brief. Whether there is any chance for the SPLM to reconcile for the people and all this. Yes. The unfortunate thing, of course, you know, I don't want to tell you about Addis Ababa. As was mentioned earlier, 7 former detainees were actually released. When they came to Addis, all of us as South Sudanese or in the region, we know them, these are the senior people in the SPLM. What the delegation of the government did the first day, they said they don't want to see them. If they come to the hall, they will walk out. So they're being denied even participation. How can the SPLM reconcile when you deny your own leaders actually to attend reconciliation meetings or negotiation for us to find a lasting peace in the country? This by itself, that the government is not serious for peace. But on our part, yes, we want them to participate. We want an all-inclusive dialogue. All South Sudanese are stakeholders to the conflict. Whatever is happening, let them come and discuss it. But the government is very adamant that they don't want anybody to participate apart from people who are carrying arms. And we are saying all South Sudanese are capable of carrying arms. These 7 can move out tomorrow to South Sudan and raise thousands of army. Will you talk to them because they have arms? No. So what we need is that they must come. So reconciliation within the party and on our part is okay. I don't know on the part of the government. Issue of legitimacy of the leadership. You know, Salva Kiir was a lucky man that he raised our flag as the first president of our independent country. I thought he was going to toe that line. Unfortunately, you know, sometimes they say power corrupts. He has been corrupted by some corrupt leaders in Eastern Africa, and who are actually, their interest is actually to take our resources. And he bought all that. So now his legitimacy, after killing 20,000 people, is already squandered. It's gone. I thought we were going to build him some palaces for him to retire and all this, so that we remember him. Now people are calling him, his hands are full of blood. Very innocent person. During the struggle, even up to the transition, was a good man. But suddenly he got corrupted, some few people around him, and then he could not see the direction, and he went into mobilizing a militia in the name of the tribe and kill people. So now, whatever we do, the history will not forgive him. But still, if the people of South Sudan can reconcile, definitely it can be forgiven and all this. But for legitimacy, it's already gone. I'm sorry to use an analogy like him. Virginity is lost once. So legitimacy is gone. Okay? You never repair it. Okay? In Sudan and those days, you know, with the primitive cultures and all, they go and do some stitches so that, you know, you become virgin again. That one is gone. The first day you touch it, it's finished. So it's like this legitimacy is squandered, is finished, and I'm sorry to use this. I'm just using it for the sake that no legitimacy that you can count on. It's finished. Now we are in the talks in Addis Ababa. We are trying to find an interim arrangement. If we can agree as South Sudanese, it's not necessary whoever to govern, as long as we can agree. But they're clinging to this. They don't want to hear. The delegation of the government will tell you, we don't want to hear even the word interim arrangements. It should not come in the agenda to be discussed. This is why the talks stalled in Addis Ababa. We could not continue. Participation of the 7 and the issue of interim arrangement. They refused them and the talks broke out. And that's why we are here. So we are ready for the talk. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thank you.